An 8-year-old girl's simple question silenced a crowded town hall and prompted Vladimir Putin to share a deep personal story about faith, loss, and redemption. What happened next brought everyone to tears. In a church meeting hall in Volgograd, Russia, the sound of sliding chairs and whispered conversations lightly stirred the air. This room, typically used for Sunday dinner meetings and Bible studies, was filled with an unusual atmosphere that evening. Vladimir Putin stood just slightly elevated, looking over the room. His presence was commanding, yet there was a sense of calm about him that evening, a rare sight for anyone familiar with his usual demeanor. The hall was packed, with families, retirees, and locals from the surrounding area all gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and expectation. The usual buzz of local chatter was quieter tonight, almost reverent. It wasn't just any ordinary gathering. This evening had a different energy, one that seemed to pull everyone closer, drawing them together in anticipation of something that was yet to come. People shuffled in their seats, adjusting themselves to get comfortable, but their eyes remained fixed on the man standing before them. Putin, known for his commanding speeches on policy, had always had a way of drawing crowds in. But this time, it wasn't about politics or national matters. It was something much deeper, more personal. The air seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to hear what would unfold. His extraordinary presence filled the humble hall. His orange-toned skin and signature hand gestures were familiar to everyone, but tonight he appeared unusually calm and composed. Perhaps he sensed the gravity of the event. The audience, composed of families, retirees, and locals, waited in anticipation to hear what he would say. Yet among the crowd, one figure seemed out of place, physically no different. But she stood out with her silent intensity. 8-year-old Anastasia, wearing her finest Sunday dress and clutching an old leather-bound Bible to her chest. The crowd was used to seeing politicians, dignitaries, and local figures, but this small girl drew attention in a way few others could. Her dress was simple but elegant, a pale blue that contrasted with the deep, warm tones of the room. The Bible she held close to her was a treasured possession, worn and tattered, its edges frayed from years of use. It had been passed down through generations in her family, a reminder of faith and tradition. Anastasia's mother had always told her that the Bible was a gift, something that would guide her through life. It wasn't just a book, it was a connection to those who had come before her. But tonight, Anastasia's grip on it was tighter than ever before. Her heart was racing, her palms sweaty against the leather cover. She had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The question that had been eating at her, and now it was time to ask it. Around her, the adults spoke in hushed voices discussing politics and personal matters, but Anastasia's mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on what she was about to do. She had never been one to shy away from asking questions, but this one felt different. This was a question that had been stirring within her for as long as she could remember, a question she couldn't ignore any longer.
This Bible was a treasure passed down from her late grandmother, its pages worn and gold lettering faded. Her mother had whispered to her before they arrived, "You can ask, but only if you're brave enough and if you truly want to know." Anastasia had nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She had rehearsed her question for weeks, written it in her notebook during recess, and murmured it to herself in bed at night. This question was not from childish curiosity, but one that weighed heavily on her soul. It was a question that had lingered in her thoughts, unanswered and growing more urgent with each passing day. She had seen the world around her, the joy and the sorrow, the good and the bad, and she had wondered, deeply, what it all meant. She had often asked her mother about God, but it was always answered with vague words, gentle encouragements to have faith, and reminders that some things were better left unspoken. But tonight, she had decided it was time to ask someone else. Someone who might understand, someone who might have an answer. Vladimir Putin, the leader of her country, was a figure she knew by name and by face, his image everywhere. On the television, in books, in the streets. She had heard his speeches, seen him on the news, and even though he was a distant, powerful figure, tonight he seemed close enough to touch. But what did he know about faith? Did he ever ask the same questions she had? With her Bible clenched tightly, Anastasia's mind swirled with thoughts. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about asking a question. It was about finding something more, about understanding a piece of the world that had always felt elusive. Tonight, she was ready. As the evening wore on, Putin delivered his usual speeches about policies, achievements, and Russia's future. The crowd occasionally applauded or nodded in agreement, but the energy felt colder than the rallies he was used to. His words, as always, were calculated, measured, and careful. but tonight they seemed to drift over the room, falling on ears that were not fully listening. People's minds were elsewhere, a subtle shift in their attention as they waited for what came next. The usual buzz of political discussion had quieted. Tonight was different. The air was thick with anticipation, like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something more meaningful to unfold. Anastasia, gripping her Bible tighter, waited for the question and answer session. The room seemed to stretch with the passage of time. She glanced around, seeing the adults in front of her, some nodding in agreement with Putin's words, others gazing at him with rapt attention, but none of them looked as she felt. They were caught up in the politics of the moment, in the promises and the policies, while she was consumed with something far more personal. She could feel the weight of the question pressing down on her chest, threatening to burst out, but she held it in, taking comfort in the worn pages of the Bible that had been her companion through so many sleepless nights. When the time finally came for questions, the adults in the room stood one by one, voicing concerns about local issues, national policies, and offering praise for Putin's leadership. Some asked about the economy, others about Russia's standing in the world. But no one asked the question that was burning in Anastasia's heart. No one asked the question that had brought her here tonight. Her turn was approaching. She could feel the nerves building up inside her, but she also felt a strange calm. She had prepared herself for this moment. She had practiced her words over and over. This was it. This was her chance to ask. Anastasia, a little shy, shrank further into herself. But when she felt her mother gently nudge her, she stood up deliberately. Her legs trembled, her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear. The lines seemed endless, but as Anastasia moved forward, the chatter in the room began to fade. People noticed the small girl clutching the large Bible, and whispers spread throughout the crowd. They wondered what a child like her could possibly want to ask, and why she had chosen this moment to speak. The adults shifted in their seats, some raising eyebrows in curiosity, others with puzzled expressions. It wasn't often that children took such a bold step, especially in front of someone as influential as Putin. Anastasia's mother gave her an encouraging smile, and for a brief moment, the overwhelming fear that had gripped her chest loosened. She could do this. With each step forward, her mind raced. She wondered if she was doing the right thing, if the question was too big, too heavy for someone so young to ask. But she knew that she had to ask it, that she couldn't leave this room without getting the answers she had been searching for. When her turn came, Putin looked at her, his expression softening for a brief moment. The room grew still. For the first time, the usual hum of whispers stopped completely. All eyes were on her now, and despite the butterflies in her stomach, Anastasia stood tall. She clutched the Bible tightly to her chest, her small fingers white from the pressure. The moment felt both monumental and fragile, like the world had stopped turning just for this question to be asked. Putin's voice, when he spoke, was unexpectedly gentle. "And what is your question, little lady?" he asked, his tone far kinder than she had anticipated. For a brief instant, the fear in her chest eased, and she took a deep breath. It was time. "And what is your question, little lady?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Anastasia swallowed hard, gripping the Bible so tightly her fingers turned white. Her breath was shallow, her heart racing in her chest. The room was completely silent, every eye in the hall fixed on her. The moment felt like an eternity, the pressure of everyone's gaze weighing down on her. But Anastasia stood firm. She had come this far, and she knew there was no turning back now. She had come here for a reason, and this question was something she couldn't keep inside any longer. With a trembling but steady voice, she finally spoke, her words ringing out in the quiet hall. "Mr. Putin, what does God mean to you?" The words felt heavy as they left her lips, each syllable carrying more weight than she had ever intended. The question was simple, yet it felt monumental. It was a question that had lived inside her heart for so long, and now it was finally out in the open. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eyes darted between the little girl and Putin, and a stillness descended over the crowd. Even the elderly man at the back of the room, who had been dozing moments before, seemed to wake up at the sound of her voice. The question hung in the air, charged with a kind of quiet reverence. It was a question about something bigger than politics, bigger than Russia's future. It was a question about faith, about belief, about what it meant to be human. And in that moment, Anastasia could feel the weight of everyone's unspoken thoughts pressing down on her. Putin, for the first time that evening, did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze soft and thoughtful, as if weighing the significance of her question. The room waited, the tension palpable. Putin didn't immediately answer. First he looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. Something had shifted, but he didn't speak right away. A sense of intense expectation filled the room. The usual boldness of his leadership, the calculated speeches and well-rehearsed responses, seemed to momentarily dissolve. In this moment, there was no audience to appease, no policies to promote, there was just this little girl and her question. He stared at the worn Bible, its edges curling slightly, the faded gold lettering catching the light. The Bible was old, clearly well-loved, and it seemed to have a quiet power of its own. Putin's eyes lingered on it for a moment longer than he had intended. He seemed to be searching for something, as if the question she had asked had stirred a deep well of thoughts that he had long buried. Anastasia held her breath, waiting. She had asked a question that seemed so simple, yet it demanded an answer that was anything but. The room, so full of people only moments ago, now felt impossibly small. The quiet seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Putin raised his hand slightly, almost as if to steady himself against the podium. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing as he glanced once more at the Bible. Then, slowly, he spoke. "That is a very big question," he said, his voice quieter than usual, the usual authority in his tone replaced by something gentler. "And I did not always know the answer." There was a shift in his presence. The steely exterior that had defined him for so long softened, revealing a vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. In that moment, he wasn't the leader of a nation, but a man reflecting on his own faith, on his journey through doubt, loss, and discovery. In the room, which had been waiting for a political statement, now waited for something far more human. Finally, Putin raised his hand slightly, as if to steady himself against the podium. "That is a very big question," he said, his voice slower and calmer than usual, "and I did not always know the answer." His words hung in the air, filled with a depth that no one had expected. The crowd listened intently, sensing that something profound was about to be revealed. Putin's eyes seemed to soften, and the usual hardness that accompanied his speeches melted away. He continued, his voice carrying a weight that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. "I was once a child, just like you," he said, looking directly at Anastasia, his gaze thoughtful. "And when I was young, I often wondered if there was a purpose to all the suffering and hardship in the world. I questioned why things happened the way they did, why some people had everything while others had nothing, why loved ones were lost, why life felt so uncertain." A murmur of empathy rippled through the crowd. They had heard the stories of his childhood, the difficult years growing up in Leningrad, the loss of loved ones, and the struggles of survival. Yet, to hear him speak of it so openly, with such vulnerability, was something few had ever witnessed. "But," Putin continued, his voice steadying, "over time, I came to understand that faith is not just about knowing all the answers. It is about believing that there is a purpose, even when you cannot see it. It's about trusting that there is something greater than us at work, even in our darkest moments." His words were simple but powerful. He spoke of his journey from doubt to belief, of the moments when he had felt lost, and how, through faith, he had found solace. "Faith is not an answer to every question," he said, his eyes now looking over the room, as if speaking not just to Anastasia, but to all who had gathered. "It is a way to carry on, to find strength in the face of uncertainty, to know that we are not alone." As he finished, the room was still. The crowd had been moved in ways they hadn't anticipated. Anastasia, her eyes wide, felt an unexpected peace settle over her. The question she had asked seemed to have found its answer not in the certainty she had hoped for, but in the depth of understanding that sometimes, the journey of faith itself was the answer. The crowd was moved by Putin's sincerity. Anastasia, with tears in her eyes, found a profound peace in his words. "When we feel that God is with us, that is when we find real strength," Putin concluded, addressing her directly. His voice, though steady, held a quiet resonance that seemed to touch something deep within every person present. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the raw honesty with which he spoke. In that moment, the leader of Russia was not standing above them, not dictating policies or making promises. He was speaking as a fellow human being, sharing something intimate, something deeply personal. Anastasia clutched her Bible tighter, the weight of the book feeling comforting in her hands. She had come here seeking an answer, and now, though the answer wasn't quite what she had expected, it felt right. She understood now that faith wasn't just about the questions, it was about trusting in the unseen, about holding on to something greater when life didn't make sense. The silence in the hall was profound, the air thick with introspection. People sat in stillness, reflecting on the simplicity of the moment, how a child's question had transformed the entire evening. There had been no grand speeches, no political promises, just an open, honest moment of humanity. Anastasia looked around the room, her heart lighter than it had been when she first arrived. The people in the hall were not just audience members, they were a community united by a shared experience, a shared understanding that transcended politics, religion, or ideology. They were all, in that moment, connected by something deeper than they had expected to find. Putin's gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of each person there. His usual commanding presence was replaced with something gentler, more approachable. It was as if, in sharing his own reflections on faith, he had invited the others to do the same. The audience, too, seemed to share in that quiet sense of unity, the weight of the evening settling into their hearts. The room had been transformed not by political rhetoric, but by the raw, unfiltered words of a man grappling with something as universal as faith itself. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The people who left that hall weren't just reflecting on a leader's speech, but on a lesson in humanity, something far more profound than anything they had expected when they first walked in. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere in the hall had transformed. The usual rush of chatter, the clinking of chairs, and the shuffle of feet as people filed out had been replaced with a quiet reverence. The crowd lingered longer than they might have on any other evening, their thoughts still tangled in the words they had heard. The weight of Putin's personal reflection, combined with Anastasia's simple but powerful question, had left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. It was a moment that transcended the usual political discourse, a moment that spoke to the very essence of what it meant to believe, to be human. Anastasia, clutching her Bible close, felt her heart lighter. She had come here unsure, seeking answers, but now she felt at peace. The Bible, once just a cherished family heirloom, now felt like a companion, a reminder of the faith that had been spoken of tonight. She looked up at her mother, who smiled back at her, a knowing look in her eyes. She had encouraged her to ask, and now, she could see the understanding reflected in her daughter's face. Putin, as he prepared to leave the room, cast one last glance in Anastasia's direction. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound impact her question had had. It was a subtle gesture, but to Anastasia, it felt like a seal on the evening's events, a confirmation that her simple question had been heard, not just by him, but by everyone present. People filed out of the hall in small groups, speaking softly amongst themselves. The conversations were no longer about the usual topics of politics or policy. Instead, they spoke of faith, of questions that had remained unanswered for years, of the importance of believing even in times of uncertainty. The room, once filled with a sense of division, now felt united by something greater, something intangible but deeply felt. As Anastasia and her mother stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening lift. The world outside seemed to have shifted slightly, as if the very act of asking, of seeking answers, had opened something inside her. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would, but for the first time, she felt that she was on the right path, one of faith, understanding, and quiet strength. It was a moment that would stay with her for the rest of her life, a moment that transcended politics, touching the very core of what it means to believe.